The horses suddenly ran away from the farm, leaving the farmer in shock. But a few hours later, they returned, and they weren't alone. With them was the missing Labrador puppy. What do you think happened? Write in the comments where you're watching us from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear this incredible story. The sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling fields of the farm as the farmer, Ben, pulled into the gravel driveway. In the passenger seat of his old truck sat a small, golden Labrador puppy, his big brown eyes scanning his new surroundings with curiosity. The pup's ears perked up at the sounds of clucking chickens and the soft neighing of horses in the distance. Ben stepped out of the truck, scooping the puppy into his arms. "Well, little guy," he said, smiling down at the bundle of energy in his hands, "welcome to your new home." The puppy squirmed with excitement, his tail wagging furiously. Ben introduced the puppy to the farm animals one by one. The chickens scattered nervously at first, their clucks echoing across the yard, but the puppy didn't chase them. Instead, he sat down, his head cocked to the side as if trying to understand their frantic movements. Next were the sheep, who sniffed him cautiously before returning to grazing. The cows in the nearby field paid him little attention, but the horses in the paddock stood still, their heads held high as they observed the new arrival. It was with the horses that the puppy seemed most at ease. As Ben carried him to the paddock, the pup's tail began wagging again, and he barked softly, a sound more curious than loud. One of the horses, a chestnut mare named Daisy, stepped forward, lowering her head to sniff the little intruder. The puppy stretched his neck upward, meeting her with a tentative lick on the nose. Daisy snorted softly, and Ben laughed. "Well, looks like you've made your first friend," he said, setting the puppy down. Over the next few days, the puppy, whom Ben decided to name Max, began to explore the farm with an endless supply of energy. He quickly became a familiar presence among the animals, darting around the yard and wagging his tail at everything that moved. But it was the horses who seemed to take the greatest interest in him. They allowed him to nap in the shade of their paddock and often lowered their heads to nuzzle him as if he were one of their own. Max, in turn, followed them everywhere. When Ben opened the paddock gate, Max would trot alongside Daisy and the other horses, his small legs working overtime to keep up. There was something almost protective about the way the horses treated him. One afternoon, when a large crow swooped down too close to Max, Daisy stepped forward, her powerful presence sending the bird flying. Max barked happily, oblivious to the fact that his new friends had just defended him. By the end of the week, Max had firmly established himself as a part of the farm. The animals no longer saw him as an outsider, and Ben often found himself smiling as he watched Max trot confidently through the yard, his tail wagging like a flag. In the evenings, Max liked to sit on the fence of the paddock, his eyes fixed on the horses as they grazed in the fading light. It was clear that his bond with them ran deeper than simple curiosity. He trusted them, and they seemed to trust him in return. Ben couldn't help but marvel at the connection. "You've got some loyal friends there, Max," he said one night, scratching the pup behind the ears. Max barked softly in agreement, his eyes never leaving the paddock. It was an unusual friendship, but one that felt perfectly natural on the farm. Little did Ben know, this bond would soon be tested in ways he could never have imagined. It was a warm, breezy afternoon when Ben decided to leave Max in the paddock with the horses while he attended to his chores. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the fields, and Max seemed as happy as ever, bouncing between Daisy and the other horses. Ben smiled to himself as he watched the little Labrador pup wag his tail and dart around their towering legs. The horses seemed to welcome his presence, occasionally lowering their heads to nuzzle him or playfully nudging him with their noses. Confident that Max was safe in their company, Ben turned his attention to mending the fence on the far side of the property. The day seemed perfect, but nature had other plans. By mid-afternoon, the once blue sky had turned an ominous gray. The breeze transformed into gusty winds that rattled the trees, and the first low rumble of thunder echoed across the farm. Ben paused, glancing up at the sky with concern. The horses in the paddock stirred uneasily, their ears flicking back and forth as they picked up the approaching storm. Before long, the storm broke with a sudden ferocity. Sheets of rain poured from the heavens, drenching everything in sight. Thunder cracked loudly overhead, sending shockwaves through the air. The horses whinnied and stomped nervously, their calm demeanor shattered by the flashes of lightning and the relentless roar of the storm. Max, who had been happily playing just moments before, froze. His golden fur was soaked, clinging to his small frame as he cowered under the paddock fence. Another loud clap of thunder sent him scrambling. The horses, though panicked, instinctively kept to the center of the paddock, trying to shield themselves from the chaos. But Max, small and unprepared for such a storm, became overwhelmed by fear. In his desperation, Max's sharp eyes caught sight of a small hole at the bottom of the paddock door, one barely big enough for him to squeeze through. Without thinking, he bolted toward it, his tiny paws slipping on the rain-soaked ground. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene as Max wriggled through the hole and disappeared into the stormy woods beyond. The forest was unrecognizable in the storm's chaos. Rain lashed against the towering trees, pooling on the uneven ground and turning the soft earth into slippery mud. Each crack of thunder rolled through the dense woods like a growl from some unseen predator, shaking the little Labrador pup, Max, to his core. His small body trembled uncontrollably as he stumbled through the underbrush, his golden fur plastered to his sides by the relentless downpour. Max had never been so far from the comforting sights and sounds of the farm. The familiar neighs of the horses, the gentle clucking of chickens, and even the steady hum of Ben's voice seemed like distant memories now. Instead, the forest surrounded him with noises he didn't understand, branches snapping, wind howling, and leaves rustling as if something unseen were stalking him. His usual enthusiasm and energy had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming need to find somewhere safe. He wandered aimlessly, his paws sinking into the mud with each step. Shadows danced across the forest floor as lightning illuminated the sky, making the trees appear like looming giants. Max whimpered softly, his ears flattened against his head. His instincts told him to keep moving, but his exhaustion begged him to stop. In the dim light, Max spotted a cluster of fallen branches near the base of an old oak tree. It wasn't much, but it looked like it could offer some shelter from the relentless storm. He crawled beneath the makeshift canopy, curling into a tight ball as the rain continued to pour around him. His breaths were shallow, and his heart raced, each new crack of thunder making him flinch. The cold seeped into his tiny body, and he shivered uncontrollably. He missed the warmth of the paddock, the soft nuzzles from Daisy, and the strong, reassuring presence of the other horses. Even the sound of Ben's boots on the gravel path would have been a comfort now. But here, in the heart of the storm, Max was utterly alone. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity as the storm raged on. Max's ears twitched at every unfamiliar sound, his eyes wide and searching in the dark. At one point, he thought he heard footsteps in the distance and lifted his head hopefully, but the sound was drowned out by another deafening clap of thunder. As the night dragged on, fatigue began to take over. Max's eyelids grew heavy, and his trembling slowed. His small, wet body remained huddled under the branches, his breathing steadying as the storm finally began to ease. The rain softened to a drizzle, and the thunder grew distant, leaving only the gentle rustle of the trees in its wake. Despite the calm that followed, Max didn't move from his hiding spot. He was too weak, too frightened to venture back into the unknown. He closed his eyes, hoping that when the sun rose, it would bring warmth and safety, or, better yet, the familiar voice of the farmer calling his name. For now, all he could do was wait and survive the longest night of his young life. The storm had passed, leaving the farm drenched and eerily quiet. The early morning sun struggled to break through the heavy mist that clung to the fields, casting a pale, silvery light over the soaked landscape. Ben stepped out onto the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy ground. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint smell of wet earth and leaves. For a moment, everything seemed calm, almost peaceful, until Ben remembered. "Max," he called out, his voice breaking the stillness. He scanned the yard, expecting to see the little Labrador bounding toward him, tail wagging and full of energy. But there was no response. The only sound was the distant cooing of birds tentatively returning after the storm. Ben frowned, his brow furrowing with concern. It wasn't like Max to disappear. He had always been close by, following Ben or playing with the horses. Stepping off the porch, Ben headed toward the paddock, his boots squelching in the soft mud. As he approached, the horses stirred. Daisy, the chestnut mare, whinnied softly, her large eyes watching Ben with a mix of unease and curiosity. Ben leaned against the fence, scanning the paddock. No Max. Where is he, girl? He murmured, patting Daisy's neck. The horses seemed restless, their movements subtle but unusual. It was as if they knew something had happened. Ben's chest tightened as he walked around the paddock, searching for any sign of the puppy. That's when he saw it, a small hole at the base of the paddock door. He crouched down, running his fingers over the damp wood. It was barely big enough for a puppy to squeeze through, but it was clear Max had done just that. Panic set in as Ben stood abruptly. His eyes scanned the horizon, now tinged with gold as the sun finally broke through the mist. Max, he shouted, his voice carrying across the fields. He hurried to the edge of the property, his heart pounding. He checked the chicken coop, the barn, even the woodshed, but there was no sign of Max. Each step felt heavier than the last, his worry growing with every unanswered call. He thought of the storm, the thunder, the rain, the chaos. Max must have been terrified. Ben leaned against the barn door, his hands gripping the weathered wood. The thought of Max out there alone, frightened and vulnerable, was almost too much to bear. He had been so careful to keep the puppy safe, and now he was gone. The sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the damage left by the storm. Broken branches littered the ground, puddles reflected the sky, and the air was still damp. Ben wiped the sweat from his forehead, even though the morning was cool. He tried to stay optimistic, but each passing hour without Max chipped away at his hope. The farm felt emptier without the puppy's boundless energy, and Ben's usual determination faltered. He returned to the paddock, leaning on the fence as Daisy trotted up to him, nuzzling his arm. "Where's your little friend, huh?" Ben said softly, his voice heavy with sadness. The horses seemed to sense his despair, their movements subdued as they lingered close to him. As Ben stood there, scanning the horizon one last time, a thought crept into his mind, a fear he couldn't shake. The forest. If Max had run into the woods during the storm, there was no telling what could have happened. The forest was vast and filled with dangers. Ben straightened, his jaw tightening. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. "I'll find you, Max," he whispered, his resolve hardening. He grabbed his coat and set off toward the tree line, calling out for his beloved puppy. Behind him, the horses stirred again, watching him intently, as if they too understood the gravity of what was happening. The day began with an uneasy stillness, the kind that made Ben feel as though something was about to happen. He had spent the morning searching the woods and fields for Max, calling out the puppy's name until his throat was raw, but there had been no sign of him. Exhausted and disheartened, he returned to the farm, leaning against the paddock fence, trying to gather his thoughts. The horses stood nearby, their usual calm replaced by a strange, restless energy. Daisy, his chestnut mare, paced back and forth, her ears flicking at every sound. The other horses followed her movements, their hooves striking the ground with unusual force, stirring up mud from the storm's aftermath. "What's gotten into you lot?" Ben muttered, watching them closely. He had never seen them like this before. Daisy, usually the first to approach him for a pat or treat, seemed preoccupied, her large eyes scanning the horizon as if she were looking for something or someone. The neighing started softly, almost like murmurs, but soon grew louder and more insistent. One by one, the horses joined in, their calls echoing across the fields. Ben frowned, stepping closer. It was almost as if they were trying to say something. Daisy turned to face him, stamping her hoof with an urgency that startled him. "What is it, girl?" he asked, reaching out to calm her, but she pulled away, tossing her head. The other horses mirrored her agitation, their movements synchronized as if they were part of some silent plan. Then, without warning, Daisy reared up, her powerful legs kicking at the air before coming down with a sharp crack against the fence. The others followed suit, pushing and kicking until the old wooden rails splintered and gave way. "Daisy! Stop!" Ben shouted, but it was too late. The horses surged forward, breaking free of the paddock. Ben could only stand and watch as they galloped toward the open field, their manes flying and hooves pounding the earth in a rhythm that sent vibrations through the ground. "What in the world?" he whispered, bewildered. He had seen his horses run before, but never like this. There was purpose in their movements, a shared intent that he couldn't understand. Grabbing his hat, Ben scrambled to follow them, his boots slipping on the muddy ground. "Daisy! Come back," he called, his voice laced with frustration and confusion. But the horses didn't stop. They didn't even slow down. As they reached the edge of the field, Ben realized they were heading straight for the forest. The sight made his chest tighten with a mix of dread and astonishment. He had spent hours searching those woods for Max, finding nothing but silence and shadows. What could possibly be drawing the horses there? The group disappeared into the tree line, their silhouettes swallowed by the dense greenery. Ben stopped at the edge of the field, his heart pounding. "What are you doing?" he murmured to himself. "This doesn't make any sense." He stared after them, torn between chasing them down and trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. The horses had never acted like this before, coordinated, determined, almost deliberate. Ben stood frozen, the broken fence behind him and the forest ahead. For the first time since Max's disappearance, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Was it hope? Or was it something stranger, something wilder? Whatever it was, Ben knew one thing: his horses weren't running blindly. They were on a mission, and he could only pray it would lead them and perhaps Max back home. The sun was beginning its slow descent when Ben heard it, a distant but unmistakable rhythm. The sound of hooves echoed faintly through the air, growing louder with each passing moment. He stood in the yard, frozen, straining to confirm what his ears were telling him. It was them. The horses were coming back. Dropping the bucket he had been holding, Ben jogged toward the paddock, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and confusion. The rhythm of their gallop was steady, purposeful, and unbroken, a cadence that seemed to carry more than just their return. He reached the edge of the paddock just as the first figure broke through the tree line. It was Daisy. She emerged first, her chestnut coat gleaming in the golden light of the setting sun, her head held high as if proud of whatever she had accomplished. Behind her came the others, their manes flowing, their hooves striking the ground with determined force. But it wasn't the horses alone that caught Ben's attention. There, nestled between them, almost hidden by their towering presence, was a small, golden figure. "Max?" Ben whispered, hardly daring to believe his eyes. The puppy trotted forward on unsteady legs, his fur damp and muddied but unmistakably his. His tail wagged weakly, and his ears perked at the sound of Ben's voice. Behind him, Daisy lowered her head, nudging him gently forward as if to say, "We've brought him home." Ben's knees nearly gave out as he knelt in the mud, his arms wide open. "Max!" "Oh, you little rascal," he exclaimed, his voice choked with emotion. Max hesitated for only a second before bounding into Ben's arms. The puppy let out a small, exhausted whimper, burying his face into the familiar warmth of his owner's embrace. Ben held him close, stroking his matted fur and whispering words of comfort, his relief pouring out in waves. As he looked up, his eyes met Daisy's. The mare stood quietly now, her breathing heavy but calm. Her gaze was steady, almost knowing, as if she understood the magnitude of what she and her companions had done. "You brought him back," Ben murmured, his voice thick with gratitude. He reached out to stroke Daisy's nose, his hand trembling slightly. "You really did." The other horses gathered around, forming a loose circle, their movements relaxed but deliberate. They seemed to flank Max protectively, as if their task wasn't yet complete until they knew he was safe in Ben's care. Ben's mind raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. How had they found him? Where had they gone? The questions buzzed at the edges of his thoughts, but in this moment, they didn't matter. What mattered was that Max was home, tired but unharmed, and it was all thanks to his unlikely rescuers. As the group settled near the paddock, Max turned back toward Daisy and the others. He gave a weak, grateful bark, his tail wagging faintly in acknowledgement of his friends. Daisy snorted softly in reply, nudging him once more before stepping back to join the herd. Ben couldn't stop smiling as he carried Max toward the house, his boots squelching in the mud. Behind him, the horses stood in the fading light, their silhouettes majestic against the backdrop of the forest. That night, as Ben dried Max off by the fire and watched the puppy drift into a peaceful sleep, he couldn't help but marvel at the bond between the animals. The horses hadn't just cared for Max, they had protected him, guided him, and brought him home through sheer determination and instinct. The image of Daisy leading the charge through the forest stayed with Ben long after the house had fallen quiet. It was a story he would never forget, a testament to the power of friendship, loyalty, and the incredible connection that can exist between even the most unlikely of companions. That evening, as the farm settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Ben sat on the porch, staring out at the paddock. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale glow over the land. His thoughts drifted back to the day's events, replaying every moment, the sound of hooves returning, the sight of Max trotting between the horses, and the unspoken understanding in Daisy's eyes. The puppy lay curled at his feet, fast asleep, his tiny body rising and falling with each steady breath. Max looked peaceful now, free from the fear and exhaustion that had clung to him earlier. Nearby, the horses grazed lazily, their movements calm and deliberate, as though their daring rescue mission was just another day's work. Ben couldn't help but marvel at the bond between these animals. How had they known where to find Max? What had driven them to break free from the paddock and navigate the dark, rain-soaked forest to bring him home? The connection they shared, their ability to work together despite their differences, was something Ben had never seen before. He thought back to the stories he'd heard growing up, tales of animals acting on instinct, but this wasn't just instinct. This was something deeper: friendship, loyalty, and an unshakable sense of duty. Daisy and the other horses hadn't just protected Max, they had cared for him as one of their own. Ben leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the stars. "They teach us more than we realize," he murmured to himself. Nature, he understood now, was full of lessons about trust, teamwork, and the strength of bonds that go beyond words or species. The farm felt different tonight, not just because Max was safe, but because Ben's perspective had shifted. He realized that his role wasn't just to take care of the animals but to learn from them as well. Their actions today had shown him the power of connection and the incredible things that could happen when creatures, human or otherwise, came together with a common purpose. Looking down at Max, Ben smiled. "You've got some incredible friends out there, little guy," he said softly, scratching the puppy's ear. Max stirred briefly, letting out a contented sigh before settling back into his dreams. The story of Max and the horses was one Ben knew he would tell for years to come. It wasn't just about a lost puppy and a daring rescue, it was about the remarkable things that happen when trust and loyalty transcend differences. It was a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, extraordinary acts of friendship could unfold. And now, a question for you: how did this story make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more incredible stories about the bonds between humans, animals, and nature.